Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second event with our friends at Aphios Pharma, brought to you by KiwiTech, a growing ecosystem of entrepreneurs, investors, mentors, accelerators, incubators, and corporations. We help early and growth stage startups build viable products, drive traction, raise capital, and scale their businesses. And before we get started, there's one quick disclaimer I like to read, a portion of it anyway, the greatest hits. KiwiTech is not acting as a broker, dealer, or investment advisor, and is not registered with the Securities and Exchange Commission in any such capacities. At no time does KiwiTech provide investment advice, endorsement, analysis, or recommendations with respect to securities. Information contained herein should be viewed for entertainment purposes only. KiwiTech does not verify or assure that information provided by any issuer offering its securities is accurate or complete, or that the valuation of such securities is appropriate. Investing in securities, particularly in securities issued by startup companies, involves substantial risk, and investors should be able to bear the loss of their entire investment. And that's just the quick and dirty of it. If you'd like to read the entire disclaimer, you can find it on our podcast website, which is successfullyfundedpodcast.com/disclaimer. All right, enough of that. I am your host, Doug French with KiwiTech. And as I say, we are here to talk with our friends at Aphios Pharma. And they are determining the best cannabinoids for treating chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathic pain, opioid addiction, and multiple sclerosis, and nano-encapsulate them in biodegradable polymer nanospheres to sustain their release and improve oral bioavailability. And in English, that means Aphios has an amazing new delivery system for the salutary effects, the healthful effects of cannabinoids on these illnesses and afflictions. And they've found a much better way to use nanotechnology to make sure those cannabinoids stay in our systems longer and are more effective while they're in there. And so we have several guests for our second event. We're going to talk more about the science of cannabinoids themselves, how healthful they are, how much research we've done to determine the benefits, the potential benefits that they provide from patients. And our guests are, the first you know right away, he was at our first event and was a guest on our podcast, Dr. Trevor Castor. He is the president and CEO of Aphios Pharma. We also have Judith Palmer Castor, who is the director of clinical and regulatory affairs at Aphios. And our guest, Dr. Staci Gruber, who is, among other things, as you'll see, the Associate Professor of Psychiatry at Harvard Medical School. Everyone, thank you so much for coming, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about your presentation. So please take it away, Dr. Trevor.
Thank you for the introduction, Doug, and thank you for the audience listening to our presentation today in our webinar. So Aphios Pharma, as a brief introduction, is developing cannabis-based FDA-approved drugs for anxiety, cancer, pain, opioid use disorder, and multiple sclerosis. This webinar, we will cover the science and technology of cannabis and cannabinoids as a medicine for chronic diseases, several chronic diseases. In our prior webinar, we introduced Aphios and discussed its vision, mission, and plans. In our next webinar, we will cover the business and commercialization of cannabis and cannabinoids as a medicine. And right now, as the next segment of our presentation or webinar, I'd like to introduce Dr. Staci Gruber, who is going to discuss the research and medical use of cannabis for anxiety and pain. Staci is a director of clinical neuroimaging core at Harvard Medical School and a director of the Marijuana Investigations for Neuroscientific Discovery, or the MIND program. She's an associate professor of psychiatry. Staci, you want to switch slides now?
Absolutely. Well, first, while I'm switching slides, thanks so much for inviting me to be part of what is clearly a very, very exciting time. You should at this point see some slides. Yes, we have slides? Great. And, you know, I've been at this for more than 3 decades, which is way more than half my life. But suffice it to say, cannabis and cannabinoid therapies are often used to address a range of conditions and indications, including, but certainly not limited to things like anxiety, chronic pain, mood, and sleep-related issues. And they may be an option for adjunctive or substitution treatment for conventional medications. We've certainly seen evidence. I will say that with regard to things like anxiety, the growing availability and popularity of legal cannabis, coupled with high rates of anxiety, clearly further exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic, has reignited a rather long-standing conversation about the potential effects of cannabis on anxiety. But first and foremost, it's important to remember that not all cannabis and cannabinoids are created equal. We tend to have this one word, cannabis or marijuana, and we use it to refer to almost anything that comes from the plant, which is remarkably complex and contains over 400 known chemical compounds. 100 or more of these are what we call phytocannabinoids, things from the plant that interact with our own endocannabinoid system, a system of chemicals and receptors throughout the brain and body. Our two primary players here that everyone is pretty familiar with, but I always like to make sure we set the stage. Delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, is the primary intoxicating constituent of the plant, and cannabidiol, or CBD, a primary but not the only non-intoxicating constituent of the plant. Suffice it to say, there are dozens and dozens of other cannabinoid constituents, as well as things like terpenoids, things that give cannabis its characteristic scent and flavor profile that have their own biobehavioral effects, flavonoids, etc. You get the picture. As a result, products that people use can also be rather complex. They can be plant-derived, and in the plant-derived categories, we have full spectrum. Full spectrum products are those that contain anything we can use from the plant. Cannabinoids, including Delta-9 THC, again, the intoxicating constituent, as well as a range of other cannabinoids, terpenoids, flavonoids, waxy phenols, you name it. The difference between full spectrum and broad spectrum products is simple. Broad spectrum products don't contain THC. They're not supposed to anyway. That's the point. For individuals who have either a contraindication physiologically or other reasons to avoid THC, more on that later, broad spectrum products are often the way to go. You can also have a plant-derived isolate product, things like Epidiolex, the only FDA-approved single-extracted purified CBD compound used for intractable pediatric onset seizure disorders. Isolates can also be non-plant derived. These are typically things like synthetic THC, dronabinol, and nabilone. So again, it's a complex landscape, and people use cannabinoids in different ways at different times for different reasons. One really important thing to keep in mind also is that the reasons and the rationale for use for folks is also often different. Recreational and medical cannabis use, for example, are often considered the same. Plant doesn't care if you're using it for recreational or adult use or medical use, but other people care, right? And the important differences that distinguish the two are important to keep in mind. Typically, the goal of use is the most overwhelming difference. So our recreational consumers are very interested in altering their current state of being. They want to feel high, euphoric, or generally altered. In contrast, our medical cannabis patients, and I can tell you this for sure, are absolutely not interested in getting high most of the time. They're looking to address symptoms. I want to be able to drive my car. I want to sleep through the night. I want to take a walk in the park with my husband without pain. As a result, the products that they choose and the constituent profile within the products are often different. Our recreational folks are looking for products typically high in THC, not a surprise if that's the goal. And as we know from the shift in the marketplace, we've seen a huge shift away from products that actually contain any detectable CBD. CBD has been shown to mitigate or reduce some of the less desirable effects of THC. On the other side, our medical cannabis patients choose products that may be high in THC, but are also very likely to contain other cannabinoids, including but not limited to CBD and other non-intoxicating compounds. Age of onset is also different. Our rec or adult use folks typically begin their use in adolescence or emerging adulthood. I spent 2.5 decades looking at this work, or looking at the impact of recreational cannabis use. Our medical cannabis folks typically begin their use over the age of 25, with the exception, again, of the pediatric onset seizure folks. Despite the fact that cannabis was legalized, or should I say re-legalized, in this country in 1996 in California, there have been virtually no studies that have looked at the long-term impact of medical cannabis use or have prioritized things like medical cannabis on areas like cognitive performance, clinical state. So in 2014, I launched the MIND program, Marijuana Investigations for Neuroscientific Discovery, the very first program of its kind specifically dedicated to looking at the impact of medical cannabis on a range of outcome variables, including cognitive performance, clinical state, conventional medication use, quality of life, and measures of brain structure and function using neuroimaging. We're a program of firsts in the first ever longitudinal study of medical cannabis patients that I'll show you a quick bit of data from. First to track cognition as a primary outcome variable and to use neuroimaging, and the first really to secure multiple INDs or investigational new drug approvals for formulated, targeted products designed to address specific symptoms and conditions. Really important. So I'm going to show you a little bit of data from our very first longitudinal observational medical cannabis study. Hard to imagine that there wasn't one before this, but the study is designed to look at medical cannabis patients and treatment as usual patients, patients with similar conditions and indications as the medical cannabis patients, but who elect not to use medical cannabis. And we follow them over the course of now up to 24 months. We started with a year. We also quantify their use of ecologically valid products, and we assess all of those variables I mentioned before. We have a number of other studies, longitudinal observational studies, including a study of older adults using opioids for chronic pain and whether they do or don't add medical cannabis and how that does or doesn't change their use of opioids and benzodiazepines. We have a quasi-clinical trial of veterans with and without PTSD who elect to add a high CBD full spectrum product commercially available and how that does or doesn't change things over time. But a quick word about our longitudinal observational study in terms of the overview. We're looking at all of these things I mentioned, again, cognitive performance, mood, sleep, medication use, etc., in individuals before they begin using cannabis. That's important, very important. That's a very, very critical factor here if you really want to know how the cannabis use is impacting them. We then follow them for up to 2 years, and we've just gotten permission to go up to 3 years because patients don't want to stop the study, which is great. We see them in person at baseline and again at months 3, 6, 12, 15, 18, and 24. We have monthly phone check-ins, and our patients all keep a comprehensive log of what medical cannabis products they're using, where they got it, etc. They complete very comprehensive assessments at every time point, including exhaustive clinical ratings. We have a very comprehensive assessment of their medical cannabis use using a metric that we created. We assess conventional medication use, cognitive performance, and again, when applicable and appropriate, neuroimaging. Our patients can use medical cannabis for multiple indications, and this is why this is so important. Things like pain, anxiety, sleep, mood, and other conditions, and choose their own products and regimen. These are then analyzed by an outside lab so that we get a, quote, what's in the weed factor. Otherwise, we don't know because this isn't a clinical trial. So I'm going to show you very quickly some data from about 55 patients who completed a baseline and at least one follow-up visit. And you can see overwhelmingly, these are folks who are predominantly Caucasian. They're about 49 years of age. Their duration of cannabis abstinence is also very important. These are not people who are using cannabis currently. Their average abstinence from regular cannabis use, which is more than once a month, 23.4 years. So these are not people who are otherwise using. What are they using for? Chronic pain, anxiety / PTSD, sleep, mood, attention, and other. What's other? Inflammatory bowel disease, chronic migraine, headache. On the right-hand side of the screen, you see THC and CBD exposure. That's the result of this metric we created, which has been a godsend. We can actually calculate their exposure and what you see immediately. At 3 months, this cohort is taking significantly or exposed to significantly higher levels of CBD at 155.7 mg per week than THC. That continues to be true at 6 months and 12 months. So these are people who are not necessarily looking for high THC regimens. I will give you a quick spoiler alert and tell you that in this cohort, we saw notable decreases in the use of conventional medications after only 3 months of treatment. A 13% reduction in the use of opioids, 22% reduction in the use of over-the-counter painkillers or analgesics, and a 39% reduction in the use of benzodiazepines. Striking. Important to remember, this is not the study doctor asking them to reduce. This is all on their own. When we think of what we know for medical cannabis for anxiety, we know that previous studies have demonstrated that cannabis could be effective for alleviating anxiety-related symptoms. Important to remember also that some studies show THC has bidirectional effects. Lower doses are anxiolytic, or they reduce anxiety. Higher doses can create or exacerbate anxiety. There have been a number of studies that clearly demonstrate that CBD is anxiolytic or actually reduces anxiety, including a recent clinical trial out of Japan. That said, there's not a ton of data in the literature. So in our first ever longitudinal study, not an acute administration study, but real world treatment, what we see are statistically significant decreases in self-reported levels of anxiety between baseline, 3, 6, and 12 months. Unbelievably helpful, apparently. When we think about mood and we look at previous studies, what we see is evidence for medical cannabis to alleviate or address mood-related symptoms. We did an early case series that suggested some folks after using cannabis had improved mood. Our first ever published studies from the MIND program was a pilot series of studies that showed clear clinical and cognitive improvements after only 3 months of treatment. Since then, there have been some survey data studies that have also shown improvement in mood, but I'd like to go back to the actual direct assessment of real-world patients. And here, what we see is in our patient cohort, statistically significant reductions in mood disturbance and depressive symptoms between baseline and 3, 6, and 12 months. Again, rather striking. Moving to sleep very quickly, there have been a lot of suggestions that the use of cannabinoids can improve sleep quality and decrease sleep latency, time to fall asleep. But most studies look at sleep as a secondary or tertiary outcome. We have it as a primary outcome variable, and again, significant improvements, self-reported, baseline to 3, 6, and 12 months. When we think about pain, it's important to remember that THC and CBD are both implicated in what we call anti-inflammatory processes. And to date, most studies that have looked at plant-derived products use either retrospective surveys or acute administration paradigms, typically on cohorts who don't have chronic pain. They induce pain and they see how well the acute administration of something actually alleviates it. In our real-world patients, we have a whole separate study that we published. Over the course of 3 to 6 months of treatment, we saw patients with chronic pain report significant decreases in their reported pain on the visual analog scale, the numeric rating scale, pain distress scale, and pain disability index. Really stunning. In addition, we also saw significant improvements in other areas in that same pain cohort, improvements in sleep, mood, and anxiety. So there's really a lot of evidence from these longitudinal real-world studies, at least in our hands, that medical cannabis is a viable option. In terms of our clinical trials, we custom formulate products in collaboration with a number of parties, including NIDA and industry partners and chemists. It's how we take something that looks like a murky extract and turn it into something that you see in that dropper. I'm going to show you data from our first ever study of a cannabis-derived high CBD formulation for individuals with moderate to severe anxiety. We also have ongoing clinical trials for individuals with anxiety and agitation of Alzheimer's, and some hemp-derived products for folks with moderate anxiety, and a number of pending trials, which we'll get to at some other point perhaps. Just as a quick refresher, anxiety disorders are the most common of all mental health conditions. And again, the COVID-19 pandemic did not help us. The US Census data basically showed us that 42% of people surveyed reported symptoms of anxiety or depression in 2020. December 2020, that's an increase from 11% the previous year. These anxiety disorders are often underreported and undertreated, and often occur with other conditions like PTSD, depression, and lost productivity loses the global economy about $1 trillion a year. So our first ever one-of-its-kind study, high CBD product for anxiety. It's an open label to double-blind trial design, 4 weeks of active treatment. The dose is about 10 mg per mil of CBD in a TID or 3-time-a-day dosing. They get about 1 milligram of THC over the course of 1 day. It's about 0.26 to 0.28 mg per mil. It's a full spectrum product though. Sublingual administration, as I mentioned. And what we see, and this is under review, so I can't show you the actual data, is that data from the open label phase suggests significant clinical improvement between baseline and 4 weeks. 70 to 80% reduction in self-reported anxiety, 60 to 80% reduction in mood disturbance, and in addition to improvements in sleep and quality of life. Really stunning. We also saw improvements on cognitive measures, which echo what we've seen in our observational study. And very importantly, no significant adverse events or intoxication reported by anybody. The double-blind phase is now ongoing and underway and will give us more definitive results. But one of the questions that it raised was about THC positive status. You know, if you're taking a product that's a high CBD product, will you be positive on a drug screen? Which is a great question. Thus far, there have been very few studies that have looked specifically at whether the use of these full spectrum high CBD products, which have proliferated in the marketplace, I mean, your local gas station sells them, could yield a positive result on a urine drug screen. So we monitored THC positive status using drug assays and confirmed using GCMS quantification pre versus post-treatment. And we also looked at relationships between those who are THC positive and things like demographic variables, including weight, body mass inventory or index, and creatinine, which is of course a measure of kidney function or hydration. Here's what we found. After 4 weeks, 50% of the sample was positive, for THC metabolites, which is important. GCMS confirmed these assay findings. And again, THC status was only associated with urinary creatinine, no associations with things like how much actual product they used. We weighed the bottles on the way out and on the way in, or their weight, nothing. So that's important to know, because patients who are consistently using full spectrum hemp-derived products may in fact test positive for cannabis on these drug screens. So to conclude, findings suggest that use of this custom formulated product results in less severe anxiety and fewer anxiety-related symptoms. We also see improvements in things like mood, sleep, and quality of life, and of course, cognitive performance. No adverse events or any intoxication were detected. And of course, the double-blind phase will be helpful. We are looking at this compared to a matched isolate arm. But really importantly, this study product contained 0.02% THC by weight. Remember, in the United States, legal hemp-derived products can contain up to 0.3%. That's more than 10 times the amount of THC as in my product here. And it's often assumed that folks using these legal products will be negative for THC, but these findings clearly underscore the fact that it may not be the case, and lay the groundwork and support the efforts of those creating products which are well tolerated and have no potential for positive urine screen, which lead to adverse consequences like loss of employment, legal or treatment ramifications. Critical. So with that, I would turn this back over to Dr. Castor. Let's see.
Great. Let me reshare my screen. I'd like to introduce Dr. Judith L. Palmer-Castro, who's the Director of Clinical and Regulatory Affairs at Aphios Pharma LLC. And she will touch today on the medical use of cannabis for opioid use disorder and multiple sclerosis.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Gruber. And I would just like to, my presentation is going to be fairly short in that it is really sort of an overview of other uses for CBD or cannabis. And I just like to touch again on the fact that there are many constituents, many components. Cannabis is a very complex substance, but other uses for it can be for opioid use disorder as well as multiple sclerosis, and there are other indications as well. If you speak to some people, they will say CBD and THC can cure everything, but to date, there's been a fair amount of work on these two indications, and I just like to touch on it a little bit. Worldwide, there's 275 million people who have used drugs at some point in time in their life, and about 62 million of them have used opioids, and out of that, more than half have developed a opiate use disorder. Prevention, and 500,000 of those are in the United States. This number is climbing, and the problem has been exacerbated in the last 2 years as a result of COVID-19. Prevention and treatment falls short in many parts of the world, with only 1 in 7 people with drug use disorders being able to receive some type of treatment. Despite our advances in research regarding therapy and what we know about opiate use disorder, there are few treatments, methadone being the first line of defense or the first treatment. And all others are still opioid medications in and of themselves. So we have, as I mentioned, we have methadone, we have buprenorphine, and Suboxone or naloxone can help reduce opioid withdrawal symptoms. To date, we don't really have a medication that will cure or provide any more relief than what we already have, but we do have evidence and growing information that CBD could be an effective use for this. Research into the effectiveness of cannabis for opioid withdrawal is inconsistent, and studies are needed to focus specifically on CBD for this purpose, suggesting that it can ease cravings, limit the rewarding effects of various drugs that cause substance use disorders. There are some studies that suggest that an oral dose of CBD at 400 and 800 milligrams is safe and tolerable. And there are some studies, although these are not FDA approved trials, but there are researchers out there that are looking at it, and everyone will agree that there is great therapeutic potential for help with opioid withdrawal, but clearly more studies are needed. The other area for CBD use would be in the area of multiple sclerosis. Multiple sclerosis is a debilitating autoimmune disease that tends to strike people in their early years, young adults, and it's an aggressive disease where the body's immune system attacks the central nervous system. And scientists are still trying to figure out or discover what the exact cause is. However, the general consensus is that this disease may be triggered by a combination of genetic and environmental factors. Over 2.5 million people worldwide are affected by multiple sclerosis, with nearly 1 million in the US that have been diagnosed. Until recently, treatments for MS are palliative and addressing symptoms, and there is no cure for early intervention in MS. But early diagnosis will help with palliative effects. Self-report by many MS patients that smoking marijuana alleviates some of the symptoms. However, there's nothing that actually cures the disease. So much of the research on CBD for MS involves pain has been done using oral supplements and nasal sprays. Some people report benefits from smoking CBD, but the best results we've had have been from the oral supplements as well as from Sativex, a drug that is made up of 50% of THC and 50% CBD, and has been approved in several countries, but not here in the US for treating multiple sclerosis. Researchers examined self-reported data from several hundred MS patients who were using the drug, showed that there was a 20% improvement in muscle spasticity for 70% of the subjects and 30% improvement in 28% of the patients. For about 39% of the patients, the treatment was ineffective. However, the results, the other information that was provided supports further research into cannabinoids for multiple sclerosis. And for both of these indications, Aphios is looking to develop a sustained release cannabinoid product, which will release cannabinoids over a longer period of time than the current treatments, reducing dosing and increasing efficacy. I'm going to be short because I think what's important now is to hear from Dr. Castor about the manufacturing and the combination of the work that we're doing at Aphios.
So I'm going to take it as the last part of the leg in terms of presentation. My background is in engineering, so I'm going to be the last leg of a discussion by a professor of psychiatry and a behavioral scientist. And in order to get this product into the clinic to demonstrate efficacy, we have to make it following current good manufacturing practices of the FDA, and to provide it in a facility that it will keep that product in the body for a long period of time. To cover the problem is that, cannabis use is typically smoked. As you well know, in the original plant, most of the materials are in the carboxylic acid form, so that you can only get efficacy when you smoke it or bake it. So when you smoke it or bake it, the THCA or CBDA is converted into the active components plus carbon dioxide and water. But what happens when you smoke it, it goes through your body very quickly. It's short-lived. It's like taking a hit, and pretty soon you will need another hit. If you take it orally, the compounds are very hydrophobic or oily, and they're rapidly degraded and excreted from the bodies. So this difficulty in administration says that only about 6% of the material that you take into your body will stay in your body. So we know from the previous discussions, cannabinoids can help. But what we need to do is to keep them in the body longer and protect them from degradation. And we can do so by encapsulating them into nanoparticles. But before we do that, we have to make them in a form which is well characterized and purified. And we do so by utilizing superfluids, which are carbon dioxide gases, for example, where we both do the extraction, we manage the properties of the superfluids to match the solubility functions of the cannabinoids. And we do so very selectively. So it's like taking a scalpel to go through the biomass to remove the cannabinoids. Once we extract the cannabinoids, we put them onto an online chromatographic column so they get absorbed. Then we change what is called a mobile phase so we can come back and remove them selectively. And in so doing, in a single step process, we can get purities as much as 100%. We reduce the number of extraction and purification steps tremendously. Timing is reduced. We remove, of course, all the use of organic solvents, which is an environmental issue. And we have green technology with high overall yields and low cost. Now, if you want to get more details on this process, I'm going to be presenting at the International Cannabinoid-Derived Pharmaceutical Summit in Boston. If you happen to be in Boston, it's a great city to visit in September. And I'm going to be speaking to the superfluids manufacturing of pharmaceutical-grade natural cannabinoids. Now, in terms of nano-encapsulation, what we do is a simple three-step process. It's like a three-step dance. We dissolve the cannabinoids in superfluids, the same type of fluids that we did for the extraction. So we know the conditions that we can solubilize these materials in. And these are typically hydrophobic polymers. They're typically biodegradable polymers such as PLGA or PCL. And then we mix them together and decompress them and inject them into an aqueous buffer. Upon decompression, the hydrophobic materials come out of solution. And because they're hydrophobic, they don't like the water. So they spontaneously form nanoparticles encapsulating cannabinoids. In that solution, we include a cryoprotectant, such as 10% sucrose, so that once the nanoparticles are formed, they're sustained in terms of their structure. Now, what is a nanoparticle? These are about 200 nanometers in size. A nanometer is 1 billionth of a meter. You can fit millions of nanoparticles onto the tip of a pen. So they're very small. And we eliminate the use of toxic organic solvents, no residual organic solvents in the final product, and minimal processing cost. So these both manufacturing and drug delivery technologies are covered by 16 issued patents and provisional patents on drug discovery, manufacturing, delivery and use, and route of administration are pending. So thus, as a company, we have the freedom to operate in terms of how we manufacture and how we nano-encapsulate. In terms of traction, we've had several research collaborations with the National Institutes of Health, which is the premier research organization, both for the manufacturing of Delta-9 THC and the nano-encapsulation of Delta-9 THC for marijuana addiction with the National Institute on Drug Abuse, NIDA, NIH, and also for the cGMP manufacturing process with CBD, which process led to this slide, this picture on the right-hand side of my slide, which is an image of highly purified CBD following this process. We've collaborated with Rhodes Pharma to nano-encapsulate Delta-9 THC in both polymer nanospheres and liposomes, and collaborated with Alexa Pharmaceuticals to manufacture Delta-9 THCA, and with Prevalence Pharma in Florida to manufacture transdermal patches of Delta-9 THC and CBD. In terms of manufacturing agreements, we've developed proprietary technologies for manufacturing and nano-encapsulation of pharmaceutical-grade cannabinoids. And this is an example of our nanoparticles, CBD nanoparticles. It's very easily movable or powder, very light powder, almost like a salt or a sugar mix. And so you take something which is very hydrophobic and oily and make it into a dry powder. We've established manufacturing facility of 1,000 kilogram pharma grade cannabinoids per year. We have an inventory of about 1.8 kilograms. Of course, the patents. And then we have mutual non-disclosure agreements with GW Pharma, Erie Management Group, Fujimoto Pharmaceuticals in Japan, and Royal Emerald Pharmaceuticals in California. So what are our plans? Funding history, ask, and exit. Aphios Corporation, the mother company, has spent about $48 million today to develop the technology platforms and knowledge used in the manufacturing and nano-encapsulation cannabinoids. Of that $48 million, about $7.9 million was from peer-reviewed grants from the National Cancer Institute, National Institute on Drug Abuse, and National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health. Currently, we're crowdfunding of $1 million to continue development studies and fundraising to raise up to $30 million for cGMP manufacturing, to conduct IND-enabling studies, to file an IND with FDA, and conduct phase 2 clinical trials. Investors will be able to exit in 3 years in a M&A, merger and acquisition in 2025, once we have established phase 2B proof of concept in clinical trials. Alternatively, we plan to do an IPO to raise about $100 million in 2026 to complete clinical trials and file an NDA with FDA. I'd like to thank you for your attention. But before that, I would like to mention our next webinar scheduled for July 14th. We're going to cover the business of cannabis as a medicine, competitors and competitive advantages, product development plans, commercialization strategies, investment and financing strategies, and exit strategies. So this is a massive problem and opportunity. We have a vastly experienced team with key opinion leaders, patented manufacturing and drug delivery nanotechnologies, benefiting from decades of development with multiple exit opportunities. Now, I'd like to turn it over to the proctor for question and answers.
Thank you, and welcome back to the panelists. And wow, that was so informationally dense, and I want to absorb that as well as. Do you have a nanotechnology that helps me absorb information as much as it helps bodies absorb cannabinoids? If you did that, that would be extraordinary. But I really enjoyed these conversations and these discussions just because I find it sounds like something this information dense when you try to explain how much research is going on and how much knowledge we now have of THC and CBD in treating these afflictions. How much time do you spend just trying to make sure people are aware of that? How much of a struggle is it to let people know that we have so much more data about this than people might think? And I'll throw it open to anybody, but I'm generally wondering how difficult it is to communicate all this information in such a short period of time.
Well, we know it works because we have a natural endocannabinoid system. That's a simple explanation. And cannabis is an external one, so we want to get into the body. The difficulty is explaining why do we need clinical trials? Why do we need to basically to demonstrate what works, how it works, how much to take, what schedule of dosing, and what are the potential safety impacts? And that's the challenge in terms of going from where we are to the next step in terms of developing cannabis as medicines.
And while we're on that subject, that was a very important mention there, the FDA. I'm sure that the blessing of the FDA is critical in terms of how this project and other research goes forward. So let's talk about what are some of the cannabis-based drugs that the FDA has approved. What kind of others are there in the pipeline, and how is your system prepared to? Is it usable for any such composition of the drugs themselves? And are you prepared to help for this system to use any of the upcoming drugs that the FDA is poised to approve?
Well, at this juncture, the FDA has only approved one drug, and and Dr. Gruber may know more what might be in the pipeline, but I'm I'm sure there are many people working on trying to get something to the pipeline.
Let me just say this one quick thing. People often misunderstand the difference between cannabis derived and non-plant derived. The only cannabis derived current medication that is approved by the FDA is Epidiolex. That's exactly right. For intractable pediatric onset seizure disorders. The things that are, quote, non-plant derived that are FDA approved are just that. They're not cannabis. They are synthetic THC. So there's a huge difference there, just to clarify.
Well, that's an important point. And we're getting over, there's several questions in the chat here that I like to present as quickly as possible so we can get to all of them before the quarter of the hour. As is predictable, something this interesting would provoke a great bit of interest from the audience. Our first question is, when chemically processing medication, are you starting with a flower base or crude oil?
I don't know who's that's for, but
At Aphios, we start with the flower base because we can be very much more selective in taking the material out without having to create an oil. So we're very selective in removing the cannabinoids. So a flower is much more effective.
Good to know.
You can do either flower or oil, depending on the sort of the target.
Okay, and number two, given that the anti-anxiety effects of CBD are bidirectional and that concentrations of 10 milligrams per milliliter was found to be beneficial in one of your trials, do you happen to know the threshold at which the effects start going the other way?
So actually, I think the finding that I referred to as bidirectional has to do with THC. Delta 9 THC has a sort of a dose-dependent impact. So low doses are anxiolytic, higher doses of THC are anxiogenic. CBD, actually, when purified, has an interesting dose response as a curve. When it's single extracted compound, whole plant, full spectrum, or broad spectrum products don't seem to have that. And in fact, appeared to have higher clinical efficacy at lower doses than single extracted purified compounds. Really interesting. That's the kind of thing we want to look at and are trying to look at in a clinical trial now. But certainly we are seeing clinical benefits somewhere between 10, 20 and up to, we have some studies that go pretty high. But again, different from the single extracted compound range.
And while we're on that thought, a question for you as well, Staci. What impact are you seeing from terpenes on treating anxiety?
Great question, whoever this is. Good for you. So there's been a lot of interest in looking at direct impact of terpenes and terpenoids on anxiety in terms of specific ones being targeted for things like anxiety and depression, because they are often confounded with each other. So we are identifying the best terpene profiles so far that we think are important. It's very time consuming and labor intensive and expensive to do this. But we're definitely seeing some that pop out in terms of anxiety, and they're not surprising given what we know about the ways in which we treat anxiety. I think it's a little too soon to go ahead and endorse a few, but there's a few obvious players in the space. So it makes it a very interesting and exciting time with fuller broad spectrum versus isolates. So.
Well, as we approach the quarter of the hour, I'm grateful to all three of you for presenting your disparate work in this way. I think it's set a lot of, created a lot of background in terms of the mass of knowledge that Aphios has put together and used to create this new technology, this nanotech, which serves to revolutionize how people, not how much people know about the treatment, but also how effective that treatment can be. So once again, I want to thank Dr. Trevor Castor. I want to thank Dr. Judith Palmer Castor and Dr. Staci Gruber for their contributions today. And thank you all for our attending audience and for their very informed questions about this topic that I'm going to go spend about another hour reading about, because whenever I have events like this, my mind buzzes too much and I need to go and learn more about what I've just learned. Anyway, thanks again for discussing that with us. Thank you for joining us today. And again, as Dr. Castor mentioned, there will be a third event, which we will link to as well when the time comes. In the meantime, thank you for watching. Thank you for joining us today. And we will see you next time from Kiwi Tech.
Thank you, Doug.
Thank you.
Ciao.